It was a hot Thursday afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of day where the heat makes everything shimmer slightly, as if the world were holding its breath. A brand new construction site buzzed with the relentless noise of jackhammers, drills, and shouted instructions. Workers moved like ants, hoisting beams and laying foundations for what would soon become a new annex of Elevation Church, a place that promised to serve thousands. But on this particular day, a storm was brewing, not in the sky, but between two men who had yet to understand who each other really were. Steven Furtick, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap, parked his car a little distance from the site. He preferred not to attract attention. There was something refreshing about being unrecognized, especially in a place where everyone was focused on the task at hand. He didn't want to come in as Pastor Furtick. Today he was just Steven, the man whose vision was about to be realized in steel and stone. He stepped out of the car and looked at the structure rising in front of him. A mix of pride and reverence filled his chest. Years of prayers, meetings, and sketches on napkins had led to this moment. As he walked toward the main entry point, he saw a man barking orders at a group of workers near the scaffolding. The man wore a neon safety vest, rugged jeans, and an intense scowl. His voice was gravelly, loud, and filled with the authority of someone who was used to getting things done. That was Greg Hollister, the lead engineer. A brilliant structural mind, but notorious for his no-nonsense attitude and short temper. He had no idea who Steven was, and that ignorance was about to lead to a moment that no one on site would ever forget. "Hey, you! Where's your vest and hard hat?" Greg shouted, spotting Steven approaching without any of the required gear. His voice cut through the air like a whip. "This is a restricted area. You can't just wander in here like it's a Sunday picnic." Steven stopped, taken slightly aback by the aggression. "I understand, sir," he said calmly. "I'm here to check on the progress. I'm involved in the project." Greg's eyes narrowed as he stomped toward him, boots crunching over gravel and wood chips. "Involved? What does that even mean? You one of the subcontractors? Delivery guy? Donor?" He looked Steven up and down dismissively. "You sure don't look like anyone important." A few nearby workers paused, sensing the tension. Steven gave a gentle smile. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. Just wanted to see how things were going." Greg's face flushed. "Listen, buddy. We've got insurance liabilities, OSHA standards, and a whole crew trying to stay on schedule. I don't have time for curious nobodies sightseeing on my site. So, unless you're the project manager or someone who signs my checks, you can turn around and walk right back to your car." Steven didn't move. His gaze was steady but respectful. "And if I told you I was the one who approved this entire build?" Greg scoffed audibly. "Oh, give me a break," he said, laughing bitterly. "You? You're telling me you're what? The owner? The big boss man? With that baseball cap and thrift store jeans? Don't insult my intelligence." Steven stood silent for a moment, letting the air thicken with discomfort. He wasn't angry. In fact, he felt a strange sense of humor rising in his chest. But this wasn't the time to gloat. Not yet. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Steven offered, trying again to de-escalate. "No, what's happening is you're wasting my time," Greg snapped. "We're not giving tours today, Pastor Wannabe. Go read your Bible somewhere else. This is real work for real men." That line landed like a slap across the face of everyone within earshot. A couple of workers visibly winced. One of them, a young electrician named Marcus, looked at Steven with widened eyes. He recognized him. His jaw dropped slightly, but he didn't dare speak. Steven took a breath and tilted his head. "You think I'm pretending to be someone I'm not?" Greg waved him off. "I think you're some preacher who wandered in here thinking he's going to sprinkle holy water on the cement and call it a miracle. This building's going up because of my sweat and calculations, not because some guy in skinny jeans said a prayer over it. Now seriously, leave." A long silence fell over the site. Even the machines seemed to quiet for a moment. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and calmly dialed a number. "Hey, Jenna." "Yeah, I'm at the site. Could you ask Robert to come out here for a moment?" He paused, then added with a slight smile. "We're having a bit of a Communication issue. Greg watched him, confused. What do you think you're doing? You'll see, Steven said, still calm. Minutes later, a man in a suit appeared from one of the temporary office trailers. It was Robert Jameson, the head of project coordination for Elevation Church. As soon as he saw Steven, his face lit up. Pastor, I didn't know you were coming today, Robert said, hurrying over and shaking Steven's hand with reverence and excitement. Greg's expression dropped. Pastor? Robert turned to Greg, eyebrows raised. Greg, did you not realize? This is Pastor Steven Furtick. He's the founder of Elevation Church. This entire project is his vision. Greg's face drained of color. He looked from Robert to Steven, suddenly realizing the gravity of what he'd just done. The man he'd humiliated, insulted, and mocked was the very person funding and overseeing the entire construction. Steven extended his hand, still composed. I believe you owe me a hard hat, Mr. Hollister. Greg stared at Steven's outstretched hand, frozen in a moment of disbelief. He felt like the ground beneath him might collapse. Everything about the man he had ridiculed just moments before now carried a different weight. The casual clothes no longer suggested insignificance. They symbolized humility. The quiet demeanor wasn't weakness. It was strength. I had no idea, Greg finally stammered, his voice barely audible. Steven chuckled lightly. Clearly, he replied, still offering his hand. After a long second, Greg shook it, his grip weak, like a man who'd just realized he'd misjudged someone who held more power than he could comprehend. Around them, workers began whispering, exchanging glances. The story would spread like wildfire across the site by the end of the day. Robert, trying to smooth things over, said, Pastor Furtick comes by unannounced sometimes to see the progress firsthand. He likes to stay connected to the people who are building the vision. Greg cleared his throat, then wiped his palms on his jeans. Pastor, I'm deeply sorry. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I was just doing my job. But I completely understand if you want me off this project. Steven looked at him with a gaze that seemed to see deeper than appearances. Greg, I'm not interested in firing anyone today. You've got a tough job, and I respect that. But I do believe this is a chance to have a deeper conversation, one that goes beyond titles and first impressions. Greg nodded slowly, still ashamed but listening. Tell me something, Steven continued. Do you believe in second chances? Greg hesitated. I guess I do. I've needed a few myself. Good, Steven said, because so have I. There was something about the way he said it. Not preachy, not dramatic, just honest. For a man as proud and pragmatic as Greg, that hit harder than any sermon. He found himself looking at Steven not just as a pastor or even as a client, but as a man who led with something rare, grace. Come walk with me, Steven said. They moved away from the main work area, past beams stacked in piles and stacks of blueprints clipped to wooden frames. Greg remained quiet, still processing the shock. Steven spoke as they walked. When I started this church, I didn't know if anyone would come. We rented out a high school auditorium, set up folding chairs every Sunday. No team of engineers, no architects. Just a few crazy people who believed that God wanted to do something big. Greg listened, his curiosity overtaking his embarrassment. I've seen this place grow from a dozen people to thousands, Steven said. And through it all, I've tried not to forget one thing. People matter more than appearances. They stopped by the edge of the framework where the sanctuary would eventually rise. You see all this steel? Steven gestured. It's strong, sure. It can hold weight. But if the foundation isn't right, if it's just slightly off, the whole thing can crumble. Same with people. You can be tough, efficient, brilliant, but if the foundation of how we treat others is broken, it won't hold. Greg took that in. You're right, and I hate to admit it, but I judged you hard, just based on how you looked. You wouldn't be the first, Steven smiled. Greg chuckled nervously. Still, I've worked on hospitals, stadiums, even museums, but never a church. I guess I didn't understand what this place meant to people. Steven's eyes lit up. That's the beauty of it. It's more than a building. It's hope poured into concrete. It's healing held up by columns. It's a home for broken people trying to find peace. Greg looked down, scratching the back of his neck. "I've built a lot of things, but I've never thought of it like that." Steven nodded. "Maybe this project is as much for you as it is for the people who will sit in those pews someday." Greg blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe this is your moment to rebuild something in yourself, too. Doesn't have to be dramatic, just, honest." Greg exhaled slowly. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Pastor. I've pushed people away, gotten too focused on deadlines, budgets, ego. My wife left me 2 years ago, said I didn't know how to listen. I haven't stepped foot in a church since my mother's funeral." Steven didn't flinch. "And yet here you are, building one." Greg laughed dryly. "Yeah, irony, right? Or purpose," Steven countered. "You don't have to believe in everything I do, but I do believe you're here for a reason." For a long moment, the two men just stood there, watching the skeleton of the future sanctuary stretch toward the sky. "I want you to stay on this project," Steven said. "But not just as an engineer. I want you to come back here next week. Not in that vest, not with a blueprint, just as a man. Sit in on a service. No pressure, no spotlight. Just listen." Greg was quiet, then finally nodded. "All right, deal." As they walked back toward the main trailer, a few workers glanced away quickly, pretending not to eavesdrop, but their expressions said it all. They'd seen something unexpected, something powerful. When Greg stepped back into his role on site, the barking was gone. The commands were firm but human. And Steven. He went back to being just Steven for a while longer, content in knowing that something greater had been built that day, something you couldn't see in the blueprints. The next few days passed quietly on the construction site, but the energy had shifted. Workers spoke in hushed tones when mentioning Pastor Steven, and even Greg moved differently, less rigid, more aware of the people around him. It wasn't just about beams and budgets anymore. Something sacred had started to stir in the bones of the building, like the structure itself was beginning to understand its purpose. Greg kept thinking about what Steven had said. It echoed in his mind when he reviewed floor plans, when he checked load-bearing walls, even when he drove home alone to his empty apartment. "You're here for a reason." It was the kind of thing people say in movies or sermons, but somehow from Steven, it felt personal, real. On Sunday morning, Greg sat in his truck in the Elevation Church parking lot, engine running, unsure whether he'd actually go inside. He wore a clean button-down shirt, but his hands kept fidgeting with the sleeves, like they didn't belong to him. It had been years since he'd stepped foot into a church. The last time it was to carry his mother's casket. That memory still haunted him. The smell of lilies, the weight of loss, the silence of God. But here he was, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he turned off the ignition. As he walked toward the entrance, he noticed how different it all felt from what he expected. There were no stained glass windows or old wooden pews. Instead, smiling volunteers greeted him with genuine warmth. A young woman handed him a cup of coffee and said, "We're glad you're here," like she actually meant it. Greg nodded and walked into the main auditorium. It was modern, almost like a concert venue, with soft lighting and rows of comfortable seats. A gentle hum of anticipation filled the space. People weren't whispering reverently. They were laughing, chatting, hugging. It felt alive. He found a seat near the back, hoping to stay invisible. The band came out first, playing music that didn't sound like anything he remembered from old hymnals. It was vibrant, filled with energy and emotion. Something stirred in his chest. Not quite faith, not yet, but maybe curiosity. Then Steven stepped on stage. Gone were the jeans and baseball cap. Today he wore a dark blazer over a simple black shirt. His presence was confident, but approachable. He began to speak, not with fire and brimstone, but with stories, real stories, about failure, forgiveness, rebuilding, about how sometimes the greatest structures in our lives are built only after everything else has fallen apart. Greg sat still, arms crossed, but every word dug a little deeper. "Maybe you've been building walls instead of bridges," Steven said, looking directly into the crowd. "Maybe you've been using your strength to protect your wounds instead of healing them. But God doesn't waste anything, not even your pain. He'll use it as cement if you let him." Greg swallowed hard. For the first time in a long time he felt seen. When the service ended, he didn't rush out. He stood up slowly, glancing around at the sea of strangers who somehow felt familiar. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't raise his hand for prayer, but something had shifted inside him. Monday morning, Greg was the first one on site. He stood in the middle of the steel skeleton of the sanctuary and looked up through the beams at the blue sky above. The sun filtered through in golden rays, almost like it was reaching for him. He pulled out a notebook from his bag, not a blueprint, but a journal. He hadn't written in one since college. He opened it to the first blank page and with hesitation wrote, "I don't know what's happening in me, but I think I'm ready to listen." Later that day, Steven showed up again. This time, Greg walked up to him first, a hard hat already in hand. "I owe you a thank you," Greg said. Steven raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not walking away when you could have. For not firing me. For making this something more than just a job." Steven smiled. "I didn't make it more. You did. I just reminded you." Greg laughed softly. "I used to think people like you were fake. All talk. Flashy pastors with big stages." "I get that," Steven replied. "There are plenty of flashy ones. But the ones who stay? The ones who listen more than they speak? That's where the real work happens." They walked the perimeter together again, like they had the week before, but now it felt different. Greg pointed out areas of progress, explained technical challenges, even cracked a few jokes. And Steven listened, not as a boss, but as a friend. As the sun began to set, casting warm gold over the structure, Steven paused. "You know what I see when I look at this place?" he asked. Greg shook his head. "I see lives that haven't even walked through those doors yet," Steven said. "Addicts who'll find recovery, marriages that'll be saved, kids who'll find mentors, lonely people who'll finally feel seen." Greg looked around. "I never thought about who the building was for, just how to build it." Steven looked at him, eyes full of quiet wisdom. "Maybe now you'll build differently." Greg nodded. "Yeah, I think I already am." They stood there in silence as the sky turned orange. Two men from very different worlds, an engineer and a pastor, brought together by one unexpected moment of humiliation that turned into transformation. And the work continued. The next few weeks brought significant progress on the construction site. Beams rose taller, concrete hardened into pathways, and glass panels began to reflect the North Carolina sky. But the most noticeable transformation wasn't the structure, it was Greg. The man who once barked orders and walked with clenched fists now moved through the site with something like purpose. Not just the kind that builds walls, but the kind that builds people. He started learning the names of the workers. He brought extra coffee for the electricians one morning, joked with the welders during break time, and even helped a young apprentice who had dropped his father's hammer and broken it. Greg paid for a replacement himself. People noticed. Not just the laborers, but the project managers, vendors, even the janitorial staff. There was a new spirit flowing through the place, one that made the long hours feel lighter. It wasn't about religion. It wasn't even about Steven. It was about dignity, respect, connection. Greg found himself thinking about things he hadn't considered in years. His childhood in Michigan. His mother's voice when she used to read him psalms before bed. The church potlucks he used to attend with her, long before his father left and before life made him cynical. Those memories had been buried under layers of blueprints and bitterness, but now they were rising to the surface, uninvited and yet strangely welcome. One afternoon, Steven showed up with his young son Elijah. The boy ran around the site excitedly, pointing at cranes and trucks with wide eyes. Greg spotted them and approached, smiling. "This your little guy?" he asked. Steven nodded. "Yeah, this is Elijah. He wanted to see where the giant church castle is being built." Greg chuckled. "He's got a good imagination." "I like that." Steven knelt beside his son. "Elijah, this is Mr. Greg. He's one of the smart men helping build the castle." Elijah extended a tiny hand. Greg shook it gently. "Nice to meet you, sir," Greg said playfully. "Thanks for letting me help." The boy grinned and ran off again, chasing a dragon only he could see. Steven and Greg stood there watching him, smiles lingering. "You ever think about having kids?" Steven asked. Greg's expression faltered for a moment. "We tried. My wife and I. But Life had other plans. She couldn't, and I didn't know how to handle it. I buried myself in work instead of being there for her. Eventually, she buried our marriage. Steven nodded. That kind of pain doesn't go away easily. No, Greg said. But lately, it's like something's been softening. Like maybe I'm finally digging through all the concrete I poured over my own heart. Steven looked at him, eyes thoughtful. Sometimes God doesn't demolish us when we're broken. Sometimes he just renovates. Greg smirked. You're good with words. Steven shrugged. That's my job. But I think you're starting to see the blueprint too. Later that evening, as the crew wrapped up, Greg sat alone on a concrete step near what would eventually be the main stage. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "It's not just a building. It's a place where people will find the pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever. Maybe I'm one of them." That night he drove to his ex-wife's house. He hadn't been there in over a year. She opened the door cautiously, surprised to see him. "Greg?" "Hi, Laura," he said, his voice rough. "I know it's late. I'm not here to fix anything, I just wanted to say I'm sorry." She stood silent for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one they used to share pancakes at on Sundays. He told her everything. About the humiliation, about the church, about Steven, about the shift happening inside of him that he didn't fully understand. And for the first time in years, Laura saw the man she had married, not the one buried under years of resentment, but the one who used to cry during movies and hold her hand during storms. "I'm not asking for us to be anything," Greg said. "I just needed to tell you that I finally see where I went wrong, and I hope someday you can forgive me." Laura looked at him, her eyes moist. "Maybe you're not the only one who needs to rebuild." He left her house that night with no promises, no guarantees. But something had shifted, the same way foundations do right before the walls begin to rise. Back on the site, as the weeks passed, Steven and Greg developed a bond that went beyond client and contractor. They had lunch together on Tuesdays, prayed briefly before big milestones, and once even shared tears when a worker's son was diagnosed with leukemia. Together they organized a fundraiser for the family, $40,000 raised in less than 2 days. The entire crew rallied. Greg spearheaded the effort. "People don't follow blueprints," Steven said one day, watching the site hum with unity. "They follow builders." Greg looked at him. "I used to think my job was just to make sure things didn't fall apart." "And now?" Steven asked. "Now I think it's about making sure people have something to hold on to when they do." The day the roof was finished, the crew gathered for a moment of silence. Greg stood next to Steven at the front. No speeches, just a quiet moment of reverence. The kind that can't be measured in square footage or cubic tons of cement. It was sacred. And as Greg looked out at the team, the welders, electricians, masons, engineers, he didn't see workers. He saw lives being rebuilt, starting with his own. 2 months later, the building was nearly complete. The walls were up, the roof sealed tight, and the sanctuary interior was beginning to take shape. The design team moved in, setting lighting angles, installing sound equipment, and laying carpet where thousands of feet would one day tread in worship. But despite all the work and progress, Greg felt something stirring in his chest, a restlessness, like a voice whispering to him just beneath the surface of his thoughts, nudging him towards something he wasn't quite ready to admit out loud. He'd been attending services every Sunday since that first visit, sitting in the same section, 5th row from the back, notebook in hand. Not because anyone told him to, not because Steven expected it, but because something kept drawing him in. The messages felt like they were written for him. One Sunday, Steven preached a sermon called Blueprints of the Heart. He talked about how God often gives us the framework of who we are, but it's up to us to build something within it, to take responsibility for the condition of our soul, for the way we treat others, for what we build with our hands and what we carry in our hearts. Greg sat in that service with his arms crossed at first, but by the end, his hands were resting in his lap, palms open. Steven said something that hit like a wrecking ball. Some of us have spent our lives constructing walls so high that even God seems far away. But walls don't just keep people out. They keep healing out, too. Greg couldn't shake that line. That week, he went home and tore open a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were photos of him and Laura from happier times. Their wedding, their vacations, the day they closed on their first house. A picture of her laughing in a field of sunflowers, hair blowing in the wind. He stared at that one the longest. The next day, he showed up to the site and walked to the front of the sanctuary. The stage was almost finished now. The baptismal pool behind it was being tiled. He stood in silence for a long while, then pulled out his phone and called Steven. "I need to talk," he said. An hour later, they sat together in a small meeting room just off the main office trailer. The walls were bare, but the air was full of tension. "I think I'm supposed to do more than just build this place," Greg said quietly. I think I need to rebuild my life." Steven nodded, saying nothing, waiting. "I've been going through the motions for so long," Greg continued. "Chasing contracts, chasing money, chasing approval. But I was never building anything that lasted. I was just stacking bricks over the emptiness inside me." He paused, then laughed softly. "And then I met you, and you reminded me that maybe it's not too late. That maybe God doesn't stop handing out blueprints just because you messed up the first one." Steven smiled, his eyes warm. "God always has another plan, even when we tear down the first one, or the second, or the seventh." Greg exhaled. "I want to be baptized." Steven blinked, not because he was surprised, but because the moment carried weight. "You sure?" Greg nodded. "I've spent my life building things for everyone else. Now I want to build something with God." That Sunday, Greg stood in front of the congregation, a towel over his shoulder and trembling hands at his side. The sanctuary still smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, but it was alive with music and praise. Hundreds of people watched as he stepped into the water, guided by Steven. Steven looked out at the crowd, then back at Greg. "This man," he said, "was once a stranger to this place, a visitor to a job site, but God had other plans." He saw more in Greg than a resume or a reputation. He saw a heart ready to be rebuilt. Greg swallowed the lump in his throat. "Greg," Steven continued, "do you believe that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior?" "I do." "And do you believe He's forgiven your sins and given you a new life?" "With everything in me," Greg said, voice shaking. "Then I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." Greg went under the water. For a moment it felt like the world stopped, like time froze, like everything that had weighed on his shoulders was finally sinking beneath the surface and staying there. When he rose, the crowd erupted in applause. But Greg didn't hear them. He heard silence. And in that silence, peace. That night he sat on his apartment balcony, wrapped in a blanket, sipping coffee, and looking at the stars. He called Laura again, not to rekindle anything, but to say thank you, for the memories, for the lessons, for the patience she had once shown him. "I think I finally get it now," he said. "I wasn't just hard on you. I was hard on myself. I just didn't know it." Laura was quiet for a moment, then softly replied, "I'm proud of you, Greg." He smiled, the corners of his eyes damp. "Thanks. That means more than you know." When he hung up, he looked down at his calloused hands. The same hands that had built bridges, towers, stadiums, but now they had built something else, something eternal. As the dedication day for the new Elevation Church Annex approached, everything buzzed with excitement. Final inspections were passed, interior decor was completed, and the sanctuary looked breathtaking. Glass panels shimmered under the sunlight, casting warm, colorful patterns across polished floors. Rows of new chairs were perfectly aligned. On the center stage, a sleek black cross stood tall against the backdrop of natural wood and LED-lit panels. It was modern, yet sacred, bold, yet humble. Greg walked through the completed building the night before the grand opening. It was quiet, empty, but alive in its stillness. He moved from room to room slowly, taking it all in. Not just the craftsmanship, but the purpose behind it. The youth hall, where kids would find belonging. The counseling rooms, where marriages would be mended. The sanctuary, where tears would fall and hope would rise. He ended up in the back, where a small plaque had just been mounted on the wall. It read, "Built on Faith, Designed with Love, a place for the broken to be made whole. Below the inscription, there was a list of names: project leaders, sponsors, contributors, and his. Greg Hollister, lead engineer. He stared at it for a while, then sat down on the nearest bench. His phone buzzed with a message from Laura. Saw the baptism video. I cried. Maybe we can have coffee soon. Just talk. Greg smiled, typing back. I'd like that. No expectations. Just two people who've both been through some rebuilding. The next morning, the church filled early. The air buzzed with joyful chaos. People hugging, laughing, music filling every corner. Families arrived dressed in their Sunday best. Volunteers directed parking, waved signs, passed out programs. Greg, dressed in a clean navy blazer and jeans, walked in through the side entrance. This time, not as a visitor, not as a supervisor, but as part of the family. Backstage, Steven adjusted his mic and paced slowly, praying under his breath. When Greg entered, he smiled. You ready? I'm not even the one preaching, Greg joked. No, Steven said, but your story is already speaking louder than anything I'll say today. They clasped hands for a brief moment, then Steven stepped out into the roaring applause of the full house. His voice carried through the room like a wave of light. Welcome home, Elevation Church! The crowd responded with cheers. I look around this space and I see a miracle. Not because it's big or beautiful, but because of what it represents. Every brick, every panel, every wire in this place was put together by human hands. But the vision behind it? That came from God. Greg stood off to the side, heart pounding. He wasn't used to being part of the spotlight, but then Steven said something that caught him off guard. There's someone here today who helped build this place. But more than that, God used this project to rebuild him. I didn't ask his permission, but he's about to forgive me. The crowd chuckled, curious. Steven continued. A few months ago, this man yelled at me, right here on this very ground, told me to get off his job site. Laughter rippled across the sanctuary. He didn't know who I was, and I didn't introduce myself. I let it play out. Because sometimes God works through conflict. Sometimes, Grace walks onto a construction site wearing jeans and a baseball cap. Steven turned toward the side stage and motioned. Greg, come up here for a second. The room exploded in applause. Greg froze. Steven grinned. Don't make me come get you, man. Reluctantly, Greg walked up onto the stage. His face turned a shade of red he didn't know he could produce. But when he looked out into the sea of faces, smiling, clapping, welcoming, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like belonging. Steven placed an arm around his shoulder. This is the guy. The one who made sure this building didn't collapse. But more than that, he let God rebuild him. And I just want to say publicly, Greg, you're not just a name on a plaque. You're part of the foundation of what this church stands for. Greg didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just nodded, eyes glistening, and stepped back off stage to a standing ovation. Later that afternoon, after the celebration ended and the building slowly emptied, Greg wandered through the halls one last time. Not to inspect, not to measure, just to feel. He ended up in one of the smaller rooms designated for prayer and counseling. It was quiet, with a single light illuminating a table with a Bible on it. He sat down, opened the book randomly, and his eyes landed on a verse, Isaiah 58:12. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. He smiled. The engineer in him appreciated the poetry of it. The man in him believed it. He closed the Bible gently and whispered, "Thank you." When he stepped outside into the afternoon sun, he saw Laura standing by his truck. She waved, holding 2 coffees in her hand. Greg walked toward her, not with a blueprint in hand, but with open arms. And somewhere behind them the church stood tall, complete. Not just a monument of faith, but a living, breathing reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things are born from brokenness. Greg and Laura sat in a quiet park not far from the church, sipping coffee and talking like old friends. The weight that had hung between them for years seemed lighter now, as if forgiveness had found a way to seep through the cracks of their broken history. There were still scars, but now they were just reminders of battles survived, not wounds still open. "So, you actually get on stage now?" Laura teased, smiling behind her cup. Greg laughed. "Let's just say that wasn't part of the original construction plan." "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her eyes scanning his face. "Not for getting baptized, not even for building that church. I'm proud of the man you're becoming." Greg looked down, modest. "I'm still under construction. Aren't we all?" she replied. They walked a little after that, through rows of tall oaks with leaves beginning to turn. Greg felt something shift in him again. Quiet, subtle, like a compass slowly correcting its course. Being with her didn't bring back regret. It brought peace. Closure, maybe, or a new beginning, depending on where the road would lead. Back at the church, Steven sat in his office, reflecting on the dedication service. Photos from the day flooded social media. Videos of Greg on stage, kids dancing in the aisles, testimonies from families who had waited years for a space like this. Elevation's inbox was full of messages from other churches asking how they could replicate the vision, the design, the energy. But for Steven, one moment stood above the rest. Greg's face when he stepped out of the baptismal waters. It was the face of a man who'd come home after years of being lost. The door knocked gently, interrupting his thoughts. It was Marcus, one of the electricians from the project. He looked nervous, holding his cap in his hands. "Hey, Pastor, you got a second?" Steven waved him in. "Of course, sit down." Marcus hesitated before speaking. "I've been working jobs like that one for a long time. Schools, malls, banks. But something felt different with this place. I saw guys like Greg change. I saw people crying during lunch breaks. I didn't know a job site could feel like that." Steven nodded. "God builds wherever we let him in." Marcus swallowed. "I haven't prayed since I was 12, but I want to try again. I just don't know how." Steven smiled warmly. "You don't have to know how. You just have to want to." They bowed their heads, and in that small office, another blueprint was laid out, not on paper, but in the heart of a man who'd just taken his first step towards something deeper. Elsewhere, Greg had returned to his apartment. It looked the same as always, clean, practical, lived in, but something about it now felt temporary, like he didn't belong here anymore, or at least not in the way he once did. He walked into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a manila envelope he'd been avoiding. Inside were old contracts, certificates, licenses, proof of his achievements, his accolades, the things he once used to measure his worth. He flipped through them and then carefully placed them back inside. Then he opened his laptop. A new document. At the top, he typed, "Vision for a new chapter." He began writing ideas, not for buildings, but for people, for mentorship programs on job sites, for recovery support for construction workers, for second chance hires, people with records, people nobody wanted to give a shot. He wrote and wrote until the words stopped feeling like ideas and started feeling like calling. The next day, Greg returned to the church for a meeting with Steven and the executive team. He walked into the conference room with the envelope and the document in hand. "Is this about final invoices?" someone asked. Greg shook his head. "No, this is about what comes next." He passed the printed pages across the table. Steven picked them up and started reading, eyebrows raising as he scanned the text. He smiled before he even finished. "You want to build a ministry?" Steven said. Greg nodded. "Not with sermons, with boots and work gloves, with real opportunities. I've seen too many guys who just need someone to believe in them." Steven leaned back in his chair. "You sure you want to do this?" Greg hesitated only for a second. "Yeah, for the first time in a long time, I'm sure." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Steven grinned. "Welcome to the team." From that day on, Greg wasn't just the guy who built the church. He became the guy who built bridges. He launched the program 2 months later. Second Story, a ministry initiative focused on helping people rebuild their lives while helping build the church. Ex-inmates, recovering addicts, single parents, veterans, all given paid work opportunities through the church's ongoing construction and maintenance projects. Greg supervised every one of them personally. At the first orientation, he stood in front of 25 men and women, tough faces, tired eyes, people who had been discarded by the world. "I don't care what your past says," Greg told them. "I care what you build from here." He gave each of them a hard hat with their name on it. One man broke down crying right there. Greg patted his shoulder and whispered, "It's okay. I cried the first time too." He walked out of that room with his heart full, his steps steady, and the quiet certainty that he was no longer just building buildings. He was building lives. Months passed, and Second Story grew faster than anyone expected. What began as a small program operating out of a storage room behind the main church building soon expanded into a fully equipped training center. They installed welding stations, carpentry benches, electrical labs, and even mock construction zones for hands-on learning. The walls of the new building were filled with photos, before and after shots of lives reclaimed, stories of redemption scribbled on whiteboards, and thank you notes taped up by trembling hands that had once signed arrest warrants or rehab intake forms. Greg didn't just run the program, he lived it. He knew what it meant to lose everything but still be offered grace. And now he offered that same grace to every person who walked through the door, wearing fear in their eyes and doubt in their bones. One rainy afternoon, a young man named Jalen showed up, clothes soaked, shoes worn thin. He had just been released from prison after serving time for armed robbery. He had nowhere to go and no one to call. Greg met him at the entrance, handed him a towel and said, "You're not late. You're right on time." Jalen stared at him. "Why would you let someone like me in here?" Greg smiled. "Because someone once let me in." Jalen became one of the most talented framers the program had ever seen. 6 months later, he had his own crew. Stories like Jalen's multiplied. Women who had escaped domestic violence rebuilt their confidence with every tile they laid. Men who had spent decades behind bars now taught younger recruits the right way to use a saw. The site wasn't just a place to learn, it was sacred ground, a sanctuary for those who never thought they'd be accepted anywhere again. Meanwhile, Greg kept showing up every day, clipboard in hand and prayer in his heart. Sometimes he still struggled with the guilt of his past, the marriage he couldn't save, the people he'd pushed away. But every time he handed someone a tool belt or watched them master a new skill, a little more of that weight lifted. Steven often visited the center, sometimes just to sit in the back and watch the miracle unfold. One day, as they stood outside the main bay doors watching a group of trainees lift a prefab wall into place, Steven asked Greg, "Did you ever think it would come to this?" Greg shook his head. "No, not in a million years. I used to think my life peaked when I got hired to design stadiums. Now? Watching Jalen get certified last week? That felt like the Super Bowl." Steven nodded. "You're doing holy work, Greg." Greg looked at him, quiet for a second. "Funny thing is, I used to think the holiest thing I could do was build a church. And now?" Greg looked back at the workers. "Now I know the holiest thing I can do is build people." That Sunday, Steven invited Greg to share a short message at the church's morning service. Greg stood on the same stage he once feared walking across and looked out at the crowd. This time his hands weren't trembling. He took a deep breath and said, "A while ago, I yelled at the wrong guy on a construction site." Laughter rippled through the congregation, but that moment turned out to be the best mistake I ever made, because it led me here. And now I get to watch God take broken people and turn them into builders, not just of structures, but of hope, of faith, of purpose. He paused. "I used to think I was just here to lay concrete. Turns out, I was laying the foundation for something eternal." After the service, dozens of people lined up to thank him. Parents, teenagers, city workers, retirees. They saw in him something real, something raw. A man who had fallen and risen again by grace, by faith, and by sweat. Later that evening, Greg returned to the prayer room where he'd once read Isaiah 58:12. The room was quiet, dimly lit, and warm with the scent of cedar. He opened his notebook and flipped to the first entry, the one that read, "I don't know what's happening in me, but I think I'm ready to listen." He smiled and wrote beneath it, I listened, and God spoke through steel, sweat, and second chances. The next morning, Laura joined him for coffee before he left for the site. Their conversations had grown deeper over time, gentle, unhurried. They laughed more now. They forgave more easily. There were no expectations, no labels, just something honest between two people who had rediscovered their own value. "Do you think you'll ever build anything bigger than that church?" she asked, sipping her coffee. Greg looked out the window where the sunrise painted the sky in brush strokes of orange and gold. "I already am," he said. And he meant it, because for Greg, the greatest structure he would ever build wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was made of people. And every time he handed someone a second chance, he was adding another beam to that invisible cathedral of hope, one that reached higher than any spire and stretched further than any blueprint could capture. As Second Story expanded, word of the program reached beyond Charlotte. Other churches began sending representatives to observe and learn. Nonprofits called to offer partnerships. Even local government officials reached out to explore how they could support or replicate the model in other communities. But for Greg, it was never about scaling. It was about serving. Every new trainee, every nervous handshake, every broken soul who walked through those wide bay doors became another chance to prove that restoration wasn't just possible, it was real. One morning, as Greg made his usual rounds through the site, he saw something unusual. A man in a dark suit, polished shoes, and a stiff posture stood at the edge of the gravel path, observing the activity. He looked out of place among the noise and dust of labor. Greg approached with curiosity. "Can I help you?" The man turned. He was in his mid-50s, stern face, clean hands. "You Greg Hollister?" "I am." The man extended a hand. "Name's Philip Granger. I'm from Harborstone Development Group. You built a few structures for us back in the day." Greg narrowed his eyes, searching his memory. "Yeah, I remember the name. Luxury condos on Lake Norman, right?" Philip nodded. "That's right. You were one of the best we had. Then you disappeared." Greg offered a polite smile. "I didn't disappear. I just stopped building for profit and started building for purpose." Philip looked around at the site, watching a group of women learning how to install drywall. "I'll admit, this wasn't what I expected, but it's impressive." Greg crossed his arms. "What brings you here, really?" "I've got a proposal. Harborstone just got approval for a mixed-use development in Uptown. Office towers, retail space, residential units. Big project. We want you to lead it." Greg blinked. "You want me to come back?" "You've still got the license, the track record. We'd offer top dollar. Benefits, bonuses. We'll even name the plaza after you, if that's what it takes." Greg looked past him, toward the trainees smiling and laughing as they hoisted wooden frames into place. "How many second-chance hires would you allow on the crew?" he asked. Philip frowned. "We have strict background checks. You know how it works. These kinds of jobs require clear records." Greg nodded. "Then I'm not your guy." Philip looked shocked. "You're turning down 7 figures to build with former inmates and dropouts?" Greg smiled. "No, I'm turning down 7 figures to keep building meaning." Philip shook his head, frustrated. "You were always good, Greg. Too good to waste your talent on some church charity project." Greg's eyes locked on his. "You see a waste. I see resurrection." Philip left, clearly annoyed. But Greg didn't regret a word. Later that afternoon, Steven found Greg sitting on the back steps of the new training facility, drinking from a water bottle and wiping sawdust from his shirt. "I heard you turned down a fortune," Steven said, sitting beside him. Greg grinned. "Yeah, guess I'm not as easy to impress these days." Steven looked at him with pride. "You're living the kind of sermon most people only preach." Greg shrugged. "I don't always know what I'm doing, but I know where I'm supposed to be." That evening, Greg stayed late at the site. Most of the crew had gone home, but he liked walking the empty halls when it was quiet. The echo of his footsteps reminded him of where he'd been and how far he'd come. He paused in the break room, where someone had pinned a photo collage on the bulletin board. Pictures of Jalen receiving his certification. A woman named Rosa smiling beside the first wall she'd ever helped build. A group of trainees huddled in prayer before starting a new project. Above the collage was a sticky note that read, "Thank you, Mr. Gregg. You didn't just give me a job, you gave me my life back." Gregg stared at it for a long time. He sat down at the nearest table and opened his journal again. This time he wrote, "They call me an engineer, but lately I feel more like a gardener, planting seeds, watering them, watching lives grow in places where the soil once seemed dead." Outside, the lights of the church glowed softly in the dark, like a lighthouse for the weary. And inside that lighthouse stood a man who once thought his only value was in what he could build with his hands, only to discover that the greatest work of his life was the one God built inside his heart. The one-year anniversary of the church annex opening arrived with a clear sky and the kind of calm that felt ordained. Families gathered outside early, lining up for what had become more than just a church service. It was now a community heartbeat. Inside, volunteers arranged chairs, sound checks echoed through the sanctuary, and Gregg stood in the hallway beside Steven, both watching the building come alive again. "So," Steven asked, smiling, "did you ever imagine that yelling at a stranger on a job site would lead to this?" Gregg chuckled. "Honestly, I still think about that moment sometimes. The way I barked at you, told you to leave. I didn't just humiliate you, I embarrassed myself." Steven leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Gregg, you didn't humiliate me. You helped me remember why grace matters more than pride." Gregg turned to him. "I didn't know who you were. If I had... but you didn't. And that's what made it real." Steven interrupted gently. "That's why your story resonates. Because people mess up all the time. But not everyone chooses redemption when it finds them." The sanctuary lights dimmed slightly. Service was about to begin. As they stepped toward the stage, Steven paused. "After the message, I want you to close the service." Gregg's eyes widened. "What?" "You've earned it." Gregg swallowed hard. "I'm not a preacher, Steven." "You don't need to be," Steven said. "You just need to be honest. That's what brought people here in the first place." The worship team started and the crowd stood, hands raised in unity. The music soared, and Gregg stood side stage, heart pounding not with fear, but with reverence. He remembered standing in that same spot a year ago, drenched in guilt and disbelief, when Steven revealed his identity to him in front of the crew. He had never felt smaller. Now he felt grounded, strong, whole. After Steven's message on restoration, on God using the least likely people to build his kingdom, he invited Gregg up. The applause began before he even reached the pulpit. Gregg stood there, eyes scanning the crowd. He saw Laura near the front, smiling softly. He saw Jalen beside a group of new trainees. He saw Marcus, now a deacon, standing with his wife. He saw faces of those whose lives were no longer crumbling structures, but rebuilt temples. He took a deep breath. "I used to think that being strong meant never showing weakness," he began. "That success meant never admitting failure. But I was wrong. Real strength is owning your brokenness and letting God turn it into a foundation." The room was silent, listening. "I spent years building skyscrapers, malls, office towers, but they never filled the emptiness inside me. Until one day I walked onto a church construction site and yelled at the wrong guy." Laughter erupted. Gregg smiled. "That man? He could have fired me, embarrassed me, gotten revenge. Instead, he gave me a hard hat." More laughter and nods of knowing. "I didn't know he was Pastor Steven Furtick, but that was the point. He didn't use his title to demand respect. He showed me who he was by how he treated me. And that changed everything." He paused. "Since then, I've learned that you don't have to wear a collar or carry a Bible to be used by God. You just have to be willing. Willing to listen, willing to grow, willing to be humbled and still show up." A few people wiped tears from their eyes. "Now, I don't just build churches. I help build people, because I know what it's like to be lost, and I know what it feels like to be found." He looked out at the crowd, his voice steady, his heart full. "And if you're here today thinking you're too far gone, too broken, too late, let me be the first to tell you, God is still building with you, and He doesn't make mistakes. He makes masterpieces, sometimes with bruised hands and busted pasts." He closed his eyes for a moment. Thank you for letting me be part of this family, for giving me grace, for letting me rebuild. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was deeper. It was honest. People stood, not because it was expected, but because something inside them had been touched, stirred, moved. After the service, people came up to him in waves. One man said he was quitting his job to start a non-profit. A woman in tears said she was going to forgive her father after years of silence. Another young man asked how to join the next second story session. Greg didn't rush the conversations. He stayed late. He listened. He hugged strangers. He prayed. As the sun dipped low over the Charlotte skyline, he stepped out into the parking lot and looked back at the church he once built as a job, now standing as a monument of grace. Laura joined him a few minutes later. "So what's next?" Greg smiled. "Same thing as yesterday, which is, keep showing up, keep building, keep believing that every person, no matter how broken, can be part of something sacred." She linked her arm with his, and together they walked into the fading light. Two people rebuilt, restored, and repurposed, not by plans on paper, but by the blueprints of grace. If you've made it this far, maybe this story touched something deep within you. Maybe you saw a bit of yourself in Greg, the weight of past mistakes, the burden of pride, the ache of trying to rebuild your life from the rubble. Or maybe you saw yourself in Steven, quietly carrying grace, extending forgiveness, building not just structures, but people. Whichever it is, remember this: we all carry blueprints. Some are tattered, some are blank, some we've followed faithfully, others we've abandoned halfway through. But the beautiful truth is that it's never too late to pick them back up, to start again, to let God be the architect of something new. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to show up, humbly, willingly, ready to be rebuilt from the inside out. Because you are not your failures. You are not your lowest moment. You are not the voice that told you it was over. You are a masterpiece in progress. And if God can use a construction site to heal a broken heart, imagine what He can do with yours. So don't keep this story to yourself. If it spoke to you, share it. Send it to someone who might be standing at their own foundation, unsure if they can build again. Remind them, they don't have to do it alone. And if you feel that stirring in your chest right now, that quiet whisper in your soul, that's not just emotion, that's God knocking. Open the door, let Him in, and watch what happens when grace picks up the hammer. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this message with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next story. But until then, keep building.